So with that, I want to introduce our very first session for Mo Technical. It'll be an API quick start guide. And really, APIs are used ubiquitously throughout all sorts of different marketing technology platforms. So they're very important. No matter what you use, what type of tools you use, there's an API for that. If you will. And so our first speaker is going to be Tyrone Pretorius. As Mike had mentioned, Tyrone's active in our community and has been wonderful to be able to share all sorts of content and his expertise working as the marketing operations lead at Telnex. And so with that, I want to welcome Tyrone, and I'm going to turn off the screen share and hand it over to you, sir. And I'm going to just double check that you're unmuted, and we'll take it away.
Sweet. Thank you very much, Mike and Mike, for the introductions. I'm very glad to be here and share what I know about APIs. My main objective today, as I've been joking, is to demystify the API. So I'm going to walk everyone through what an API is and how to make your first GET and POST request using a tool called Postman. So as Mike mentioned, I'm Marketing Operations Lead at Telnex, and this is a telecommunications startup based out of Chicago. And this is where I do all the cool marketing operations and automation work that I then blog about in my personal site called the Workflow Pro. And last but not least, as has already been mentioned, I'm a MO Pros ambassador, which means I'm contributing content to the site, and I'm doing webinars like these. So the overview for today's meeting is I'm going to walk you through what an API is, and then secondly, why you should care and where APIs are used in the day-to-day. And then I'm going to show you how to make your first GET and POST requests in the Postman tool. And then finally, we're going to cap things off and take the training wheels off and show you how to transition from Postman to programming scripts in your favorite programming language and the Zapier automation tool. So before I go any further, I just want to say that in case you're frantically trying to grab a piece of paper and a pen or get a document ready to take notes, I've got most of everything I'm going to cover here in this first blog post, which is the Marketo API Quick Start Guide. This is Marketo focused, but a lot of what is in here is generic and it will apply to any API. So you can take a look at this afterwards, and there's no need to take notes unless you want to. So what is an API? An API stands for an Application Programmable Interface, and I know unabbreviating those three letters doesn't make it any more clear. So the way I like to think about an API is a way to get information from a system or push information to a system using URLs. So we can see on, whoops, didn't want to click that. We can see in this section here, this is actually an API request for my company Telnex. We're a telecommunications provider and we're very API focused. And we provide APIs for communication. So for sending messages, for conducting calls, we even have an API for our wireless SIM. And this here is an example of how you can send a text message using an API request. And the URL that we're going to send this information to is this URL at the bottom. And the URL structure for any API will be the same. You'll have a common base, which in this case is api.telnex.com. And then you'll have different endpoints based on the different functionality you're trying to achieve. So using the Telnex example again, we'll have a messaging endpoint to send and receive text messages. We'll have a voice endpoint and we'll have a wireless endpoint as well. So this is the URL that we're going to make requests to. And requests can take on many different types, but the two most popular ones are a POST request and a GET request. So with the POST request, you're pushing information to a database. With the GET request, you're retrieving information from that database. So in the context of sending messages, a POST request would allow you to send a text message, whereas you'd use a GET request to retrieve information about a phone number to see if that phone number is a landline or a mobile number. So those are the two request type. And then digging here more into the body, we can see that, I'm just going to exit this for a second. We can see that we've got a data section here, and this is commonly referred to as the payload of the API request. And we can see in here, this is where we're specifying the information to tell the Telnex system which number we want to send the text message from, the number we want to send the text message to, and finally the text that we want to be in the text message. And then up the top, we've got something called a header. And a header you can simply think of as the settings and configuration for the request that you're about to make. We're telling the Telnet system to expect the content of this request to be an application JSON format. And JSON format just means you've got a key in inverted commas, and then you've got that key's value also in inverted commas separated by a colon. That's JSON format, and this is an example of it. And then finally, you need the necessary information to be able to retrieve information from the system or to post information to it. So that's why most API requests will have an authorization header where you specify your authorization parameters to let the system know you've got the necessary permissions to make the request. So this little snippet here is the post request to send an SMS message. And the power of APIs is that you can integrate them into your different programming scripts to facilitate automation and to do things programmatically. So for this webinar today, if we had webinar SMS reminders and we wanted to send a text message to every person who'd registered to tell them the webinar is starting in 15 minutes, we could do this with a Python script making this request inside a for loop. So for each number in the list, send a text message to this number. So I've just begun to touch on it there, but the main power of APIs is behind how they can help you facilitate automation. And I stuck this quick GIF in for any Rick and Morty fans out there like me, because I was watching this while preparing the webinar and this quote stuck out to me as being quite pertinent. So I decided to stick it in for the Rick and Morty fans. So as Michael mentioned before, every SaaS company is built on APIs. Dropbox has an API, Salesforce has an API, Marketo has an API, HubSpot has an API. And I think the best example out of any of this is Zapier. I'm just going to log into our instance quickly. Here we go. So for those of you that don't know, Zapier is an automation tool, and it allows you to make workflows, which they label as ZAPs, Z-A-P-S, and each workflow consists of a trigger that will set off a sequence of actions, and following every trigger, you've got actions that will follow and do certain tasks. So Zapier integrates with many different platforms like Marketo, HubSpot, Dropbox, etc. through APIs, but it abstracts things a level and makes it very easy for you to interact with these platforms and make your workflows by using a graphical interface. So you can click buttons, you can set up your triggers, you can set up your actions all graphically, and then a layer below, Zapier is going to make all the API requests to Dropbox, to Marketo, to Salesforce to achieve the actions that you specify in this interface. So although you mightn't notice it, any SaaS company is built on top of APIs, and that's how most data is transferred and actions are actioned upon. Move this back for a second. And moving more into marketing operations, I use Marketo. That's my main marketing automation tool. And where APIs have really helped me is to help automate processes and streamline my workflows. I think the best example of this was we had a backlog of 13,000 duplicates in our instance, and we're looking at getting a Cloudingo contract. And Cloudingo is a third-party merging tool, which would have cost us $10,000 for the year to merge the leads. And we're also coming up to our Marketo negotiations, and we are over our database size limit. So being able to use the Marketo API, it's got a merge function. Being able to use that merge function in a Python script to automatically merge these leads saved us $15,000 by getting our database size below our 100K criteria for Marketo, and also saving us from getting a Cloudingo contract. And then some other things I've used it for in the past is our product marketers will fill out Google Sheet templates for our newsletters. And then all they have to do is click a submit button, and then that will send API requests that will create the email program in Marketo and populate the email within it with the content from the email template that the PMMs had filled out. And we do the same thing for hosting content. If a product marketer wants to host a piece of content in Marketo, they just fill out a form, and then that form triggers a sequence of actions in Zapier to make API requests to Marketo to upload the piece of content straight from Dropbox to the Marketo Design Studio, and then create the corresponding content performance tracking programs. So these are just 3 examples of how I've used APIs in my day-to-day to help save me time and also save the company money. So I'm guessing, and I'd encourage you all to do the same, just think about any repetitive workflows you're doing day-to-day and start to question how you can start automating these and saving yourself some time. And now we'll get to the nitty-gritty part of the demonstration where I'll walk you through Postman, which is a free API testing tool that anyone can download for free. And I'll show you how to create an environment and variables that we'll then use in subsequent GET and POST requests. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into Postman.
I'm thrilled, just so you know, to watch this happen because I tried to mess with Postman about a month ago. And I was like, nope, don't have the time for this. So I'm glad that you're going to show me how to do it now.
I actually think it's quite a beautiful interface and such an easy way to use APIs as opposed to trying to program it straight from scratch or trying to use it in Zapier. That's why I always come to Postman as the first thing when I find a new API request I want to make, because I can test it out here and see what the response is going to be like. And it's also very easy for debugging. So this is always my first step.
Makes sense. Cool.
So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new environment to house our variables that we're going to use in our subsequent requests. I'm going to use the Marketo REST API as my example. So I'm going to make an environment for MOPros Marketo demo. And I'm going to create a variable for our base URL. These variables will become a bit more clear later on when I actually use them in examples, so just bear with me for a few moments. Client secret, client ID, and bearer token. So I've created my environment, and just for a second, I'm going to go back to our trusty guide. So what I'm doing at the moment is every API request in Marketo needs authentication. And to do this, you need an access token. And you need to make a GET request specifying the client ID and client secret in order to get that access token. So I clicked on the link here in the document that leads to the Marketo Authentication section, and it shows you how to get the client ID and client secret you'll need to get that access token. So you can do that for your instance, and then once you have that information, you can come in here, populate your client secret, populate your client ID, and then your base URL will follow. Trying to find, where's that one? Your base URL will follow this pattern, if you're a Marketo user, of course. So then we have our base URL, our client secret, and our client ID. This is what we need to make our first GET request to get the access token, or the bearer token is another terminology for it, that we'll need to make subsequent requests to the Marketo REST API. Just going to discard those changes for now.
So just to clarify on that, Tyrone, to get the token, you're essentially asking Marketo for permission to then go access more information. Is that what you're asking for? You're asking it for a key, essentially, to open the doors?
Yep, and this key will last 3,600 seconds, an hour. So you'll likely need to make this authentication request multiple times a day if you're making calls throughout the day.
Got it.
So once you've created your environment, you can select it from the drop-down menu here, and then all the variables you've specified in that environment can then be used in subsequent requests in Postman. So I'm going to transition to our Marketo environment, and I'll just give you a quick snapshot here. I've got all that information filled out. So when I test these API calls live here for you, they will work. So the next step is we're going to create our own collection, MOPros Marketo demo. And we're going to add our first request. So get access token. So if we come in here, just going to go back to the authentication for a second. So following on from this docs, I won't go through it too much in detail because you can always look at it afterwards. We need to make a request to this URL specifying parameters such as the client ID and the client secret in order to get the access token returned to us so we can use it in subsequent calls. One quick thing to note here is that this identity URL they use is slightly different than the base URL I use in Postman. And the reason for that is that the only call in the Marketo REST API library that uses the /identity is this authentication request. All the other calls will just stop at .marketorest.com. So that's why I just left it out. And this will become a little more clear as I show you. Did I copy that link? Okay. So base URL. So as I'll make this a little more clear. So as I was explaining, our base URL stops at marketorest.com. There's no /identity. So I'm just going to add that in manually at the start. And then everything after the question mark here is referred to as a query parameter. And we can see just by pasting it in here, Postman automatically takes all those query parameters and puts them in a key value format for us. So it's very easy to change. And since we have environment variables, for our client secret and client ID, we're going to enter those here and we access them using the double curly brackets. And now we're ready to make our first API request. I'm just going to click send here. And there we have it. That's our access token that we'll need in subsequent requests. And we'll see it'll expire in under an hour's time. So now you'll notice what you'll typically need to do is we've got the bearer token here, access as a variable. So we can use this as a variable in subsequent requests. But it's a bit of a pain to manually copy that variable and put it in here every time. So we can see that this variable is outdated since the last time it was updated. So you'd have to manually paste it in like that, which is a hassle. So a quick trick I'll show you, which I wasn't using for a long time until recently, is to include a small piece of JavaScript that will automatically populate that token for us. So this is just a quick, simple piece of code that will listen out to the response from Postman, which is this, and it'll store in a variable called JSON data. And then it's going to parse out the access token, which is this value here. And it's going to set that bearer token environment variable equal to the access token and do that automatically. So to show you an example of how this works, I'm going to clear this for the moment. So we can see it's completely empty now. And if I run this again, we can see our time has gone down. Obviously, access token is the same. And now we see it's automatically been populated here. So this is just a very quick few lines of code that I implemented. So when I'm testing in Postman, it's very easy to click send here. And I've already got the bearer token ready to go for subsequent requests. And so that was our first GET request completed. Pretty easy, I hope. So the next step is we're going to build on that and use the access token return to do something a little bit more useful. So this one is going to be update program description. And we want this to be a post request because we're going to be pushing information to Marketo. And same as always, it's always going to start with our base URL. And then the request we want to make will be in the Marketo REST API documentation. If you're using the Marketo REST API, this is the equivalent of your Bible. It's your go-to for getting requests to modify assets, to modify leads, etc. So I'm looking for the programs section, and I'm looking for the update call. So we can see that this is the endpoint we're going to make the request to. We see that the content type it requires is XWW form URL encoded. So I'm going to put these into Postman quickly. So that's the endpoint we're going to specify it to. The body, as mentioned, needs to be XWW form URL encoded. And as you can see, as we're going through this, Postman makes it very easy to get started to make this request. And then we can see we can edit the description of the program, we can edit the name, and we can also edit the program costs. So I'm going to copy these parameters. So let's call it costs, name.
And Tyrone, just as you're doing this too, I think it's good to mention that you know, HubSpot and Salesforce and other platforms have a developer documentation, and you can sign up for developer instances that you can just use for posting using the exact same JSON type of responses that you're doing here, right?
Yep. So although I'm focusing on Marketo here, everything I'm telling you about Postman and everything I'm doing here can be applied to any API in general. So now we've got the parameters that we want to update updated. We need to tell Marketo that we have the necessary authorization in order to update this program. So we're going to do that by selecting the bearer token option. And Postman is smart enough to automatically populate the bearer token variable we have in our environment in here. And then, is there anything else? Yes, I think we're ready to make our first request. And just to show you, Postman is very intelligent. Once we selected this radio button, it sets a content type for us automatically. So it handles a lot of the stuff, so we don't have to worry about it, which is fantastic. And sorry, the last thing we need to do is the program ID of the program we want to edit. So to quote chefs in every cooking show ever, here's one I prepared earlier. If you want to extract the program ID of any program you want to modify, you can go to the URL and copy it. So I'm going to put that here. And just to show you before I make any updates, the name of the program is currently MO Pros API Quick Start Demo. There's currently no description, and there's no costs associated with this program either. So when I make this request, we can see that the request was successful. It's updated the name of our program, it's updated the description, and it's added program costs to the program as well. So if we come back over here to Marketo quickly, I'll just refresh this. We can see that it's updated the description, it's updated the name, and we have our program costs for this month in Marketo. So there we have it. That's how you can make your first get and post requests in Postman. And the next thing you want to do is transition to something more advanced like Python and Zapier. And the reason for that is, using the example again of merging leads, if you've got 13,000 leads, I do have a Postman call set up to merge leads, but obviously you don't want to have to click this button 13,000 times or enter these parameters for the leads you want to merge 13,000 times. So this is where you need to transition to a programming tool like Python, which will help you make these requests programmatically and take all the manual work out of it for you. So the one I like to use is something called PyCharm. But if you just want to experiment, if you Google any like online Python compiler, you can test out Python calls in an online browser. You don't need to download anything, but I'm pretty sure I didn't pay for PyCharm, and I'm pretty sure they do have a free version you can access for free if you want to start testing out here. So now to make the transition, Postman makes it super simple for us. Let's go back here to our get access token. If you click on the code button here, Postman will actually give you the code needed to make that request in up to 27 different programming languages. So anything from C, C#, JavaScript, and Python is my favorite, so that's the one I always use. So I'm just going to take this code, copy it, go straight to PyCharm, and then I'm just going to, go run. And we can see that this call works straight out of the bat from Postman to Python in 5 seconds, which is fantastic. And I'm going to do the same for the update program description. Okay. Going to copy this code. And then I'm going to run this. Then similarly, we get another successful API request. So Python is fantastic if you're trying to do things in bulk with, say, if you're backdating, like merging those 13,000 duplicates. But when you're trying to do something that's trigger-based, this is when you need to transition to an automation tool like Zapier. So if you want to merge a lead as the duplicate is created in Marketo, then you'll need to set up a workflow in Zapier that will listen out for when duplicates are created. So that's the difference between, say, using Python here and using Zapier. Python is for backdating and backlogs, whereas Zapier is for triggering and listening out to events that you want to action upon. So moving in here, as I mentioned before, Zapier integrates with many different platforms, and Marketo is one of them. So you might be wondering, oh, why do we need to learn about APIs if Zapier handles it all for us? Well, the thing is, Zapier has limited engineering resources and not enough time. So Marketo has over, I'd say, 200 API requests in its library, but the functionality you can use through Zapier for Marketo is very limited. They only have one trigger, for example, which is when a new lead is created. And they only have 3 actions: create or update a lead, add lead to list, find lead. There's no way for you to edit programs, edit forms, edit leads outside of these 3 actions. So this is why all the information you gain today will help you become a power Zapier user, because you can make your custom API requests to any API you want using the code by Zapier action. So again, I'm going to use Python because that's what I'm most comfortable with. Get access token. And then, so all I'm going to do here is I'm going to transition to a file I prepared earlier. It's the exact same as this one here, except I've just tidied it up to use some variables in the URL. And the reason for this will become clear in a second. It just makes it easier to transition to a tool like Zapier. So I'm going to paste in my code here, and then I can use the input data section at the top to populate the variables that I have down here in the code section. So base URL, client ID, client secret. So I'm just going to copy over these parameters from Postman quickly. I trust no one will steal my credentials here. We're all pals.
We'll like blur this section out in post-production for you.
Yeah, there's just no way around it. I was thinking about, is there a way I can do this to not show this stuff, but there wasn't.
Yeah.
And then all I'm going to do at the very end is I'm going to stick in 2 quick lines of code. The first line here is just going to search the response we get from Marketo for the access token and store it in this variable. And then we're just going to return that so we can access it in later steps in Zapier. So if I go test and review, base URL is not defined. Oh yes, sorry, I forgot to mention. The way you need to access these variables is using something called dictionary format in Python. And that just means you're going to put the word input, 2 square brackets, and 2 inverted commas around the variable you want to specify. So client secret. What's this one? ORI is not defined. Yep, that's my bad. So I'm using the import ORI. That's just this function here. I didn't import the library necessary for Zapier to know that I'm referencing that function. So finally, 3rd time's the charm, we have our access token. And we can now use this in subsequent API requests that we want to make. So if we go run Python again, if I go token, I can specify that. And then just to complete the show, I've done the exact same thing as before. I've just taken the response that we got from, I've taken the code we got from Zapier and just put it in variable format. Got the same as before, base URL. Just gonna add these all in. Am I missing some? Token, I think we have. Not going to be very creative with these names. Name number 3, program ID. Believe the program ID is 2912. And just while I'm typing this stuff out, if there's any questions, I can answer them while I'm doing that. This will only take a minute.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Ellie Lewis in our audience here has a couple of different questions. If you want to come off of mute, Ellie. Everybody's open to unmute right now, by the way.
Hi, this is Ellie.
Hey Ellie, how's it going?
Doing well, thanks. How about you?
I'm doing well.
Props on your multitasking skills.
Thank you.
Since you mentioned merging duplicates, I was curious about how the complexity, like to what degree that would change if you were trying to merge duplicates across or within partitions.
Okay, that's something I don't have experience with. So you're saying you've got Tyron at telnext.com in one partition and you've got another Tyron at telnext.com in another partition, and you're trying to merge the two so you only have one Tyron at telnext.com in one partition?
I would only want to merge the duplicates that occur within each individual partition.
Okay, yeah, that should be straightforward then, because I'm guessing you'll just reference a different endpoint for each partition you have. So you'll merge them all in one instance, and then you'll make a separate set of API requests to merge them in the other instance. It's just basically changing a parameter in the URL that you're specifying to point to a different instance.
Okay, cool.
Does that make sense?
A different partition, right? Not a different instance, a different partition, right?
Sorry, a different partition, yeah. And I don't I don't have this up on the MO Pros blog yet, but I do have a post on bulk merging duplicates, and I give a walkthrough of how I did it, and I share the code in GitHub for anyone to use. And it might be a bit hard to understand, so probably a future webinar I'll do is just walking people through the logic I used for merging the leads in here and how it was achieved. But if you're eager to get started, you can just take a look at this post. Okay, so
Thank you.
No worries. Let's see if this will work. Might get another error here. Hopefully not. What is it? Key error costs. Last one. So I'm going to say, let's just change this to Bing.
I've got to bounce, guys. It's Jeff. Thank you so much for putting on today. I'll
No
talk to you all
worries.
soon.
Thanks, Jeff.
Great to have you,
Thanks,
Jeff.
And that is the post request made in Zapier successfully. So just to wrap things up, I know I'm coming close to time here. I'll go back to the PowerPoint presentation I had. So we covered how to create an environment and variables in Postman, make our first get and post request. Then we took the training wheels off. We went to our Python scripts, and then we imported those Python scripts into Zapier in the code by Zapier action. So next steps for you are to download Postman. As I mentioned, it's free to download. You can follow this URL that we'll hopefully send after the presentation to everyone, and get testing. I thought this was quite cool. If you Google free online like API resources for getting post requests, you'll find many different options. This one I thought was quite cool, where it's a Pokemon database. So you can query different Pokemons, different abilities, different things like berries, etc., and it will return information about them. Like this is about a Pokemon's stench ability. It gives you all the information about that ability, etc. So you can have some fun and test that out.
That's fantastic.
Then I have started, for anyone who is a Marketo user like myself, I've started a Marketo Maestro's Postman group, and I've got 25 API requests in here that you can get started with straight away. So they're all in here. And finally, as a follow-up to this, when we do send you the email with the recording, I can send you my 100 plus API requests that I've built in Postman. The reason I don't have them up in the group is you have to pay to share more than 25 requests. So I'll just send you the file that you can import into your local Postman instance, and then you can get access to the 104 requests that I already have in Postman. So just to finish, I can stay on, by the way. I don't have to leave. So if anyone else has any questions, I'm happy to answer them for the next 15 minutes or so.
So, hi Tyrone, Kishan this side.
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, so I'm good. So basically my question is, can we fetch reports through API?
Like smart lists?
Not a smart list, like any of the report. Like if I need to create any, you know, report based on the people statuses and all.
Yeah, let's take a look. Tokens. I think that might be in the lead database. It's not something I've done in the past. Fields, companies, custom objects. It doesn't look like it based just on my initial looking here. And I've never used it, but you might be able to find something if you Google it. I'm not seeing it there.
Chime in a little bit if that's helpful, guys.
Yeah.
So one thing that you'll see here is there's different endpoints around different types of activities. So different types of opens and clicks and all the metrics that you see behind an email performance report in Marketo. That raw data can be exported out. I actually have a client right now who is built a Python connection, similar to what Tyrone's built out here. And they're exporting that into Azure to then display in Power BI. So, you're grabbing the data, you're not grabbing, you won't be able to grab any type of visualization within Postman or within Zapier per se, but you can then take that data, and if you wanted to move it to like a blob storage in Azure, or you want to move it to, let's say, a SQL database, and then use like SQL Server reporting services, or you want to use Power BI, or or Tableau or another visualization tool, that's possible.
Okay, thanks, Michael, for the explanation.
Yeah. And just to build off of that, Domo is our BI tool, and it actually uses the Marketo bulk extract API to get the data it needs on lead activity behavior and lead field data into Domo. So that's another example of where APIs are used in your day-to-day.
I guess, and just wondering about this, I'm not as familiar with Python, but I think you could use like Matplot and some of the other Python libraries if you wanted to visualize into that, couldn't you?
Yeah, I think you can. I haven't done it personally, but I'm sure that's possible.
Okay.
Do you know if there are other resources, maybe through the Postman community, where you can find like pre-built collections for HubSpot and Marketo and such?
Yeah, I haven't found any. That's why I created this Marketo one to be the first. I think I Googled like Marketo Postman collection and didn't find anything. So feel free to have a Google yourself to see if there are any HubSpot or other MarTech tools on there. I'm just curious.
I think I've looked before and it wasn't really easy to find anything. So I was going to ask you about your collection, and I'm glad to hear that you'll make it available.
Well, it seems like someone in the HubSpot community has asked this question. Do some pretty cool stuff. No official HubSpot collection exists at this time. And I think I think you won't find an official collection made by the company themselves. But as I've done here, you might find an individual who's willing to share their library. Mm-hmm. So that's probably your best bet.
Thank you.
One question I'd like to ask you. So I think, where I get into APIs without getting into the coding, and I appreciate the intro, by the way, into how to export from Postman into Python. That was new to me and it was really interesting. But use a lot of like webhooks, and actually I see some of the integration partners that will just show you how to basically use set up a webhook to post to their API for their software from Marketo, for example. Yeah. Do you have kind of best practices of when you would use just set up a simple webhook to an endpoint versus setting up code like a Python script?
I use webhooks when it's one-off interactions. So some examples I can show you in our instance. We've got some webhooks that all they do is they calculate the summation of different field values and they return the result, and then we store that result in a field. So that's one way. It's very easy. You don't need any logic to determine what happens afterwards. And similarly, we also use it for sending SMS alerts. So again, we use the Telnex SMS API I showed you earlier on, and we put that in a Marketo webhook. And again, this is one way. We just send the text message and then that's it. But if you wanted to build complex logic to handle responses, and if response is this, then send this response, that's when you need to start bringing it into Zapier or something like Python.
Really cool. Okay, thanks. And those responses too, kind of worth noting that you can write back in them in Marketo. I think the exposure that I've had in HubSpot using webhooks, you can't necessarily map back responses to a custom property in HubSpot per se. So yeah, that's one really good way to kind of use that in your Marketo instance.
Yeah, and a great example of that is Telnex has a number lookup API. So if you specify the phone number you want to look up, it'll return certain information like the country code, the city that the number comes from, the line type, whether it's mobile or a landline, and the state. And then you can then store these in Marketo fields. So this is the data returned from the request, and you can store that in the subsequent Marketo fields. So you can use this for enriching your leads if you want, because you know what city or state they're from, you know if they're on mobile or landline, so that could be helpful for your sales team. So yeah, webhooks are a great way to interact with APIs when it's kind of one way. You don't want to build any complex logic on top of it.
Really neat. Okay, does anyone else have any other questions before we end off the session? This is a great session, Darren, and thank you for this. So we'll be saving the recording of this session on the MoPros community, and so you can actually see it, and then obviously we'll edit out some of the private information that you've shared here as well too. But it'll be available to be able to view, and then that'll link back to some of the blog articles that Tyrone has reached. If people want to get a hold of you, Tyrone, to ask you questions, can they message you in the MoPros community? And what's the fastest way for them to reach you in the community?
Yeah, absolutely. Message me on the MoPros community or on the MoPros Slack if you're there. If you're not a member of the community, you can go to the workflowpro.com, and I have a bio section, and you can fill out this contact form. You can find me on LinkedIn to this link as well. Feel free to get to me through any of those forms. And if you're looking for content similar to this about how to use APIs and to automate workflows using Zapier and the Marketo REST API, subscribe to the blog here and you'll receive plenty of content like that.